lacto because it produces lactic acid bacteria. Because when we're speaking of fermentation, if we go way back in time to Louis Pasteur, I mean, he brought it out and said that it was done without air. So this is basically lacto fermentation to make sure that it's oxygen free. That's the big secret, to produce that lactic acid bacteria. Nothing to do with dairy, with the lacto. So things like your fermented vegetables, there we have our lovely daikon, the daikon in turmeric brine, and you create that environment so that it's oxygen free, so that it never ever has any air. Things like sauerkraut, that belongs to that lactic acid fermentation family, kimchi, any of your fermented vegetables, your fermented garlic cloves, all lacto fermentation, the lactic acid producing good bacteria, and they produce many different strains of it too. It's like a community of bacteria. A lot of things will cross over, like your bacteria, your good yeast, your good molds. They will cross over with different types of family. Speaking of yeast, we know our beer and bread, that comes into your yeast family. So we're speaking good yeast, speaking moulds, the mould fermentation, if we can think of something like miso, which uses a starter, and it makes many things like mirin. It's koji, that's what it is, and you can buy koji online and make your own miso, and that's a wonderful experience. So that's your miso from your mould. Some cheeses form into the mould family. So, you know, you would think blue veins and things like that, but some cheeses definitely use the mould fermentation, are part of the mould fermentation family. If we go to the acetic acid, now with acetic acid, this is the opposite. When you're creating acetic acid, well, we set up the environment so that it's created for us. It's the opposite to your lactic acid fermentation. So the acetic acid is like vinegars, and it's a two-stage transformation. So first of all, we produce alcohol. Well, it's produced alcohol for you. So this is the opposite, being that it is oxygen loving. So it likes to get air. So it's a totally different process. But once we get our head around this, we know what we're creating. Well, we don't create it, it's created for us. And this is where the little bit of confusion comes into it all. So many things come into your vinegar family, like your coconut vinegars, even your fire cider, which is like, that's all your nice warming, your chilies and your turmeric and horseradish, and ginger, and what else do we have in there? But and then that's immersed into an apple cider vinegar. And we're talking of vinegars with the mother. So the mother, it's like your bread, your motherhood bread. So it has a mother, which is like a starter. And this again is something which gets confused, that we think, do we need to have a starter to make lactic fermentation? Definitely not. No starters are required. So a lot of things have overlapped and it has caused confusion. But if you've done the correct way and going into the right families, there's never ever a problem. So I think we've covered the lactic acid, the acetic acid, we've covered yeast, the yeast family, we've covered mould family. Now there's a big confusion that floats around with honey, and people will say, oh, honey ferments. And I know I did an article on my blog many years ago to tell them about how when I first tried these little pickles, and they come from Japan, and I was very fortunate to be in Lake Biwa, and with a beautiful family where the mum actually ran a miso business in a backyard and had this beautiful little miso going that was just wonderful. And the taste of it, I learnt all these new pickles, because the Japanese are wonderful with their pickles. Even at breakfast time, you have a nice little selection, because that's the idea, you only have little bits of it. That's when I very first tasted honey garlic. And it's used just as a little condiment. You can use these as many things, but it does not belong in the fermentation family. And that's where I get into trouble, because people want it to belong. Now, it doesn't matter, because it's tasty and you still make it, but it is an infusion. There's no microbial activity that can happen with just honey. If we go way back in history, and one of the very first ferments was found was honey where it came from the beehive and came down, and the rain hit into it, and there's like a little bowl made from a leaf underneath, and the leaf had all the nice little white yeasty parts on it, which you'll see out in the garden, which is very good for fermentation because that is your good starter. And so that caused like a starter to start with the honey and the water, and it made honey wine. And of course the peeps picked it up and drank it, and they got very merry. So that's mead, and that is a fermentation, but it's a process. It's honey when you add with water or a liquid and you use a starter. So when we do this, totally different. Now, because people don't like it, I have got science on board in this one. Our fermentation back in 2004, all our fermenting families were involved in a lovely study. It was a university study, and honey garlic was one of the things, and this is the science side of it. So I will give you a read so that it sticks in. Honey is very high in sugar and low in moisture. In addition, despite containing around 17 to 18% water, the activity of water in honey is very low. This means that the sugar interact with the water molecules, so they cannot be used by microorganisms, and no fermentation or breakdown of honey can occur. So it just doesn't ferment. So but this doesn't mean to say that you don't use it, because it's a beautiful infusion. So what happens is you have your honey in there, and you put your garlic cloves, you peel garlic cloves, you put all little things. I've got cinnamon bark and bay leaves and all. The taste is just beautiful, and of course you can use the honey as well as use those, but they are an infusion. So what's happened is the honey cannot by itself produce any microbial activity. So basically what it's done is it's infused into that medium, the garlic. And you can do it with many things. You can do it with like vanilla beans, cacao nibs, beautiful, but it is a honey infusion. And it can be part of your diet, and it's nice and healthy. There was one family that I missed. I just looked down, and that's like all your milk kefirs, your symbiotic communities of bacteria and yeast. So your milk kefir, your kombucha, your water kefir, fancy forgetting that. So beautiful. Gin,